Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, and I'm here today to talk to you about this week's Torah portion. And it's a little bit of a misnomer on a couple of fronts. This is coming up. We've got Shabbat. Happens every single week. Hate to break it to you, but this Shabbat special, in that it coincides with a festival day of Pesach or Passover. And this Passover, excuse me, is extra special because Passover is falling this year in such a way that the first day of Passover was on Shabbat and the last day of Passover is on Shabbat. And because because Passover has its own Torah readings, we have preempted the normal Parashat Hashavua cycle. When I say Parashat Hashavua, that means the Torah reading of the week. And so you might have found this video because you know you're hip to the Torah readings of the week. It's like, hey, what's this week's Torah reading? But you may just be popping into this for some other reason altogether. So I want to make sure I explain everything so that we're all on the same page. So just real quick, every single week we have a reading for that week that is read in public in synagogues or in wherever people are doing their Shabbat celebrations on Shabbat. And so normally the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, are divided into 54 different sections. It's 54, not 52. I know it's a 52-week year on the secular calendar, but the Hebrew calendar kind of expands and contracts a little bit based on what year it is. And so some years we have 50 weeks, some years we have 55 weeks. And so we have this weekly Torah reading cycle is somewhat flexible, except that every single synagogue in the world just about is reading the same reading on a given Shabbat. There's some exceptions that sometimes the land of Israel is out of sync with the diaspora, but then that corrects itself very quickly. In any case, a couple weeks ago, we were reading from the book of Leviticus, and we read Parashat Re'eh, which was about skin conditions, and then we read Parashat Metzora, which was about more skin conditions, and normally right after that, we'd read Acharei Mot. But we've taken 2 weeks off because on Passover Day 1 and Passover Day 8 fell on Shabbat, so we are reading, instead of from the book of Leviticus, this Saturday, we are reading from the book of Deuteronomy, because this is the Torah reading for the 8th day of Passover. And so just for your reference, the Torah that's being read in synagogues this Saturday is Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 to chapter 16, verse 17. And then we get our maftir from Pinchas, which is Numbers 28, verses 19 through 25, I think. So that's the reading for this week. And we're going to talk about one little part of it today. Before we have just jumped in, given a lot of information, you may have said, hey, Rabbi, give me 90 seconds on this week's Torah portion so I could sound smart at my kiddush lunch. This is not one of those videos. If you want to sound smart, you're going to have to hang out for a little bit. You probably sound smart anyway. I trust you, hero. But what we like to do here is we get together and we discuss things for some length of time. So that's what we're doing today. Feel free to relax and settle in, or come back and watch this later if it's too long for you. But this is also a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. And so this may or may not make it to the airwaves as a podcast, but kind of treating this like a podcast with a live studio audience. We always have some great people here to ask questions, and I always love to give shout outs to people who are in the live chat here. And let's see who's joining us today. We see Andrew and Kathy. I was just learning about Shabbat with Andrew and Kathy, and Val also, and Milo. Welcome to the show. Let's see who else is going here. CJ Mays, Rabbi Carrier, taking your advice to shop around and look for different rabbinical schools. Oh my goodness gracious. So we might have a new rabbi here in the chat pretty soon. Although, you go to a good school, it's going to take you a few years. So we'll say soon in Jewish time, which is like slightly shorter than, glacial time, because we've been at this for a little while. Good to see Brandy here, and really glad everybody could join me here today. And we see Karen from suburban Philadelphia. Nice to see you here, Karen. So let's talk a little bit about this week's Torah reading. And so, sorry, just had a little brain malfunction there. That's the benefit of doing this thing live. See if a little rocket fuel will help that. So this week's Torah reading, again, it's from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's borrowing from another parsha that usually happens later in the year, and that is Parashat Re'eh. And in Parashat Re'eh, in chapter 15 of Deuteronomy, we have a discussion of, let's say, fiscal policy in a way, but it's also a discussion on how to manage poverty in your community. And it says that every 7 years, all debts should be released. In the beginning of chapter 15, it said every 7 years you should have sort of a remission of debts. And this isn't just like, for each person is on their own 7 year cycle, or each loan has its 7 year cycle. This means sort of everybody at the same time in the community. So, it's year 7, all debts are erased between one Jewish person and another Jewish person. And this was instituted to help eliminate poverty. Now, it wasn't designed so that everybody would always have the same amount of stuff, regardless of how skilled or lucky or hardworking they were. The Torah acknowledged from the beginning that, we would settle into the promised land, we would raise crops, and some people would have a good year, and some people would have a bad year, right? And if you had a good year, you would probably have a surplus to lend to help meet the needs of people who had a bad year, right? If you had a bad year on the farm, you might not have enough to take to market to sell to feed your family, much less buy seed corn or whatever for the coming year. And so you might need to borrow in order to sustain your family for another year. And sometimes that can get into a vicious cycle. I mean, that's why the whole payday loan thing is so insidious in American culture today, is once you start borrowing, if you have 2 bad years in a row, it's hard to pay back that first debt, and then you get deeper. And they realize that, letting indebtedness continue indefinitely could create a sort of permanent indebted class as well as a permanent creditor class, right? It's okay for people to do well based on their own ingenuity and hard work. And yes, sometimes people have a bad year, and that's just bad luck, or maybe they could work harder. You could take that different ways. But what we didn't want to have is sort of a permanent upper class and a permanent lower class, especially the people at the very bottom rung of that lower class, what the Torah calls the evyonim, right? This is different from an ani. An ani is a sort of a poor person. An evyon is like a really needy person, right? We're talking about somebody who doesn't have a roof over their head, or doesn't have food to eat, or can't support their family, which is different from just sort of like the working poor who, could, have everything they need, but not much more than that. So this was instituted because it said that, okay, if you follow this procedure of eliminating debt or canceling debts every 7 years, there should be no needy among us. It says in Deuteronomy 15, verse 4, like, there shall be no needy among you. God, Moses is saying this to the Jewish people at that time, because God is going to bless the fields that you till, and is going to bless your land with prosperity in such a way that there should be enough to go around. And if there is enough to go around, there will not need to be any truly needy people who have nothing to eat. And then it says, but just in case, right? First it says, there shall be no needy among you, because the land is going to be blessed. However, in about verse 7, it says, if there should be a needy person among you, then make sure you don't harden your heart toward that person or close your hand, because you might be afraid, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to give them this loan, and it's like year 5 right now in that 7-year cycle, and I don't think they're going to pay me back in time. And because I don't think I'm going to get paid back before the loan is released, I'm not going to give them that loan. So this, in my mind, is where the Torah has our number, in the sense that, sometimes the Torah says, oh, that doesn't describe me. That's about a bunch of Stone Age shepherds, totally unrelated to my life. But then it has these profound psychological insights into human nature that says, like, look, if we know that debts are going to be canceled, I might not want to lend anything to a poor person. If it was year one, forget about it. Like, I'd give him that easy. But because it's year 5 or year 6, I'm not so sure I want to lend to him. And I know he's needy, but I got to take care of my own. And so the Torah says, like, okay, if this happens, I'm calling you on it, and make sure you don't think that way about that needy person just because you might not get paid back for that loan. And then here's the clincher. In verse 11 of chapter 15, it says, there shall always be needy among you, so make sure you don't harden your heart and close your hand to them. And Parashat Re'eh comes up a few times during the year. We read it during its normal cycle. We read it during the High Holy Days. We read it on Pesach. And I think I was sort of wondering, why is this included in the reading for Pesach? There's another part later on in the reading where it talks about Passover. But I like to think that it's included in the readings about Passover because it says, about your needy neighbor, do not harden your heart, right? And we just had a story about that when we were talking about Passover, that Pharaoh looked on the needs of the Hebrew slaves and hardened his heart, and decided to leave them as they are in their situation rather than letting them go. And so in effect, when you encounter a poor person, and not just a poor person, but like a needy person, like a desperately hungry person, you might think, well, gosh, if I give him this, I may never see it again, and I need it for me, and I need it for my family and other things that I do with it. Or, and I'll just confess, this thought has crossed my mind sometimes, there's a person on the street asking me for money. He gives me various indications that he's not going to spend this money on food. Right, he's not going to use it to, take an Uber to a job interview. He's not going to buy food. He's probably going to spend it on some sort of substance that he is currently abusing. And I've had a person, I've offered food to a homeless person once, or to somebody who was begging, and he said, "I don't want food. You know what I want. You know what I'm going to spend money on. So I would just prefer to have the cash." And so sometimes we prejudge people who are in need and say, well, even if I give this to you, it's not going to change your situation and it may actually harm you. That's not on us to decide. Maimonides says that when you encounter somebody who's needy, if they're asking for money, even if you think they're not going to use it wisely, you are still obligated to help them. Not just for their sake, but for your sake, right? You should be a generous person regardless of what you think the outcome of that generosity is going to be. Plus, it makes up for all those times when somebody needed your help and you didn't know about it, so you didn't help them. So Maimonides encourages us to be generous with the needy as don't be generous to a fault. Don't impoverish yourself to raise others up out of poverty, but do be generous by default, right? Do be generous to say, help somebody in need, regardless of whether you think you're going to get it back, regardless of whether you think that it's going to be constructive for them or not, because it's not necessarily about them, it's about you and your predisposition towards being charitable. But another lesson that I take from this is this balance that we strike between the ideal and the real. This parsha has always presented something of a conundrum or a paradox to me, if you will, because it starts off saying, the land is so blessed that there shall be no needy among you. And then a couple of verses later, it says, just in case there are. Right? First it says there won't be, but just in case there are. And then it ends up saying, there will always be needy among you. And this puts into stark contrast for me the difference between the ideal life and the real life, right? This is, and the Torah is there to teach us both, right? It says there should be enough to go around. But we also get that you're human, and we also get that your neighbor is human, and you have luck. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have luck and you don't. And sometimes we make mistakes, and sometimes we have accidents. And there will be a real situation of need. And given that this isn't an ideal world and you will encounter this, here's how you should deal with it. And I don't think that's wrong to set up that paradox, right? If the Torah was only a practical guide to how to live your life without setting up an ideal, it would just be sort of an owner's manual of human life. But I think it also, in addition to being a very practical guide as to how to live your life, sets up an ideal to aspire to. Because if we didn't have a what could be on top of a what is, then how would we ever grow? How would we ever aspire to holiness? How would we ever aspire to generosity? How would we ever aspire to that state in which we recognize that there's enough to go around if only we're wise enough in how we distributed it, right? So it gives us this ideal to work for, and in the meantime, it gives us a practical way for living our life, right? And this is, to me, also the essence of halakha, or Jewish law. And some people take a look at Jewish law and say, oh, there's lots of rules and stuff. Can't eat bacon, right? Can't play with my cell phone on Shabbat and all these things. And it just seems to be a big buzzkill and tells me ways in which I'm wrong, and nobody needs to hear that. So some people take a look at Jewish law and they just see this is a rigid system that was designed for some saints out there and not for me, and not a practical way for me to live my life. But I look at it very differently. I look at Jewish law as being a literature that has emerged among people who hold two realities in their hands. One is the ideal state of being that we have access to, not just aspire to, but have access to as being created in the image of God. We can live an ideal life, right? We were created to live a life of justice and peace and mercy and holiness. But we also have a practical life here on earth, and most of the time, dude, we are just trying to get through the day, right? We have jobs, we have families, we have community responsibilities, we have our own needs to meet, and that takes, between, I'll say, 95 and what feels like 130% of our time. And the rabbis of the law codes and the rabbis of the Talmud and our patriarchs in the Torah and our matriarchs in the Torah were no different. They had a relationship with God that inspired them to divine behavior, but they also had mouths to feed. And our ancestors in the Torah had to thread that needle between these two realities. The rabbis were constantly trying to figure out, okay, how do we pray as often as is right to pray and still get to work on time, right? The law codes say, how do we honor the Sabbath day? And ideally, everybody should wear nice clothes and put out nice dishes and have a white tablecloth. And then one of the rabbis in the commentary say, well, what if you only have one shirt and you can't afford a second shirt? And that rabbi said, well, instead of where the law says you should wear a different shirt on Shabbat, how about we read that as you should take your one shirt and wear it a little differently? Button it up. I don't know if I buttoned my collar here, but like button it up a little differently or wear it at a different angle. You don't have to be a saint. You don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to be perfect and have no bad habits and only good ones in order to live a life of holiness and aspiration and growth. And that, for me, Jewish law is the interface between those two things. By following Jewish law, by following Jewish traditions, we have a path laid out for us to thread the needle between acknowledging our holiness as created in the divine image, but also living our daily lives. And I think that's the essence of Parashat Re'eh as well. We love the idea of a day in which everything is distributed fairly. Everybody gets what they need. We don't, people can prosper. People can, not everybody has to be rich, but everybody should have their basic needs met. That's something to work for. Until then, we have ways to make small changes with the neighbors who ask us for help. And that's the reading here for Pesach, that we're doing this Shabbat. And so going into this Shabbat, which is the last day of Pesach, oh, no, I can't eat matzah at every meal anymore, and I have to have pizza and beer right afterwards. Sorry, I'll play my tiny violin later. But going into the end of the celebration of our existence as a free people, I want you to consider, what does that freedom mean? That freedom means that, yes, we are not slaves. Yes, we get to prosper by the work of our hands instead of handing it over to somebody else all the time. But that also gives us a responsibility to use some of that prosperity to help people who just need a sandwich, just need something basic to sustain them, just need a little bit of a leg up. And that's why I think Parashat Re'eh is given to us on Pesach, so that we can use our freedom wisely, responsibly, and with justice and with mercy in the world. So that's what I wanted to share with you this week. I just want to jump into the chat to see what people are talking about. My friend CJ is talking about going to rabbinical school. My goodness gracious, CJ, it's kind of a big deal. I'm not gonna lie to you, but I had fun. I had fun in rabbinical school. It wasn't all it wasn't all cake and roses. I don't know if that's a thing, cake and roses. So sorry, this is bad radio. Just jumping into the chat to see what people are talking about here. If there's any questions that I can answer, let's see. I will say, if you've asked me a question, do me a favor. Go ahead and repeat that question in the chat in case I miss it, and make sure you have a question mark on it. That's way easier for me to see if it's that it's a question. We've got Miriam from New Hampshire has joined us. Adit says shalom to all from New York City. Count Connor is saying shalom from Burbank. Shalom to the Count. James Deagle, so good to see you. Eric is asking, can I quote Quarter Flash's Harden My Heart? Yes, you absolutely can. Only if you acknowledge that, let's see, Metallica's Creeping Death is the world's greatest Passover song. So that's just something I learned this week, is that Metallica has a Passover song. Miriam's asking, so if you know 100% that they're going to use the money on drugs, what if your money bought them a fatal overdose? Look, I hate to take anything to the all or nothing extreme. I'm going to say most of the time, Maimonides is spot on, but even Maimonides, who was a student of Greek philosophy, would say there's moderation in most things, or moderation in all things, including moderation. You know, if somebody's asking for something and you know 100% that they're going to spend the money on a fatal overdose, maybe you should spend money on them, but not hand it directly to them. Maybe donate to some sort of cause that might help them. Could be a good way to help them as well. But generally speaking, sort of barring extreme circumstances, we should incline toward generosity rather than, let's say, taking the other approach, which is what some people do and what I have done in the past. Now I think of this very differently, of not giving anything to anyone lest they might make a bad decision with it, right? Because that's an approach that in the past I've taken as well. Like, I wouldn't give money to anybody because I thought, well, what if they do something wrong with it, right? Maybe I'll just give the money to charity, to an organized charity instead. And that's a possibility. You should absolutely give things to, like, Jewish federations and Mazon. Somebody else is calling out a great organization. But I'll say, don't automatically close your hand because you think there might be a bad outcome. So what you're doing is you're making a decision about a certainty based on an uncertainty, right? The case that you cited, if you know with certainty that someone is going to harm themselves, first off, anytime you know something with certainty, you should probably question that, whether you're really that certain. But second off, do things that you think are going to help, but don't refrain from doing things just in case they might not be helpful. Good to see Trig here today. Kathy's sharing there's a time warp between video and audio here as well. I apologize for that. Sometimes these feeds don't work out as well as I'd like them to. Miriam shares there's the Jewish National Fund, has different areas to give. There's a lot of great charities out there. What I want to point out that the Parashat Hashavua points to is specifically not about gifts, but about loans, right? It's saying that on the 7th year of this cycle, loans are canceled, which gets directly into, okay, what's the difference between a loan and a gift? You can give gifts to people, but this is talking specifically about loans, right? And when you're giving somebody a loan, typically it's for something that is sustainable. And when Maimonides talks about the different levels of tzedakah, right, the different, this kind of charity is better than that kind of charity, like, giving begrudgingly is not as good as giving willingly. Giving anonymously is better than giving, publicly and boisterously. But Maimonides says the very top level of giving that there is, the best kind of tzedakah that you can give, is a loan, right? Is a loan that helps somebody start a business so that they can become self-sustaining, or helping that or giving that person a job so that they can work, or helping somebody find a job so that they can become self-sustaining. In general, the highest form of charity is helping somebody become self-sufficient so that they don't need tzedakah anymore. And it speaks of this in terms of like business loans, right? And so all of the discussion in Parashat Re'eh presumes that the money that's being given is not just a gift of money, but is a loan. And it says, don't hesitate to give a loan just because you think it might not be paid back, right? It might be paid back, but don't say just because I'm not going to get paid back, I'm not going to give it. I'm not going to give this loan at all. Maybe you give it and think of it as a gift. I've often heard it said, like, if you're loaning money to family and friends, which isn't always a great idea because sometimes it impairs relationships. But one way to forestall that is if you're lending money to a friend or a family member, it helps to think of that money as a gift before you lend it. That way, if you don't get paid back, it doesn't necessarily impair the relationship as much. We'll also quote to, Polonius's, one of Polonius's speech to Hamlet, I think it was, who said, neither borrower nor lender be. One who mixes money and friends tends to lose both. That's sometimes true. But this is saying, like, look, if you can help somebody out of a situation of dire poverty, you should. And don't withhold, like, look, if you can't afford to, then you can't afford to, and that's a different matter altogether. But if you can help someone and you hesitate to help them because you're not sure it will be paid back, then you should go ahead and make that loan. Now, a caveat to that comes up in the Mishnah, where it in a couple places in Shvi'it and also in Gittin, it talks about Rabbi Hillel the Elder, or also known as just Rabbi Hillel, a big popular character in the Mishnah, who instituted this thing called prosbul, which was a rider on debt contracts. And prosbul stated, if somebody borrowed money from you, and they had this rider that would say, even when the year of remission of debts comes around, this debt is still owed, right? And so it basically, two people could voluntarily forego that debt forgiveness in order for that loan to happen. And Hillel, very smart dude, loved the Torah, was familiar with Parashat Re'eh, but he looked around and he saw that even though the Torah told people don't forego giving these loans, people still weren't giving these loans. And he saw that the opposite effect was happening. People weren't giving the loans, and so poor people were staying in a permanent state of poverty, right? They weren't staying permanently impoverished because of the debt. They were staying permanently impoverished because they couldn't take loans out. And so what he did was he altered the system a little bit, or created a voluntary opt-out in order to make, as we would say in finance, the capital markets more liquid. And this actually helped bring people out of poverty by changing, altering the rules a little bit that we had in place, because he had our number too, right? Just as the Torah said, yes, everything's going to be blessed, there's going to be enough for everybody, but just in case there's not, here's how you should behave. And Hillel came along about 1,500 years later and said, "Yep, there are always poor people among us, and our ideal is that we shouldn't harden our hearts and close our hands, but just in case, here's an innovation, here's another way around that, so that we can help people get the help that they need." So with that, I'm going to jump back into the chat. Miriam says, I read somewhere that the best way to give money to a stranger is anonymous so that you don't embarrass them. That's really high up on Maimonides' list as well. Edith shares, is there anyone here sick of matzah? Because I am, she says. So thank you for that, Edith. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm usually done with matzah about day 4, and I think today is day 5, going on day 6. So I'm looking forward to having some less crumb-filled crackers in my life. Somebody observed earlier that we spend all this time getting rid of crumbs in our household, only to start eating matzah, which pound for pound makes 10 times as many crumbs. But Kathy shares, have you tried the chocolate-covered ones? So yeah, if you're sick of matzah, dip it in chocolate, and that might be better. Kathy's sharing, there's a recipe on YouTube for ice cream cake made of matzah. There's lots of different things you can do with matzah. Make ice cream cake. Last year, I sampled some Passover-flavored ice cream. And before you make a face because you think it's horseradish and gefilte fish, it's not. This was ice cream that was sort of a port wine and Manischewitz base ice cream. So it was sort of port wine. It was sort of a Manischewitz ice cream, sort of a sweet grape wine flavor with bits of chocolate-covered matzah in it. So, and it tasted a little bit like the best parts of, and I think it had a little haroset in it as well, some like apple and walnuts and things. So it tasted sort of like the best parts of Passover, but did not taste like chopped liver or gefilte fish or horseradish. All right, just checking the chat to see if there are any more questions today. Count Counter shares, I'm going to harden my heart. I'm going to swallow my tears. Presumably this is a song of some sort. Miriam asks, which Jewish charity is best for helping the poor? What about the federations? And when she says federations, lots of cities have what they call Jewish federations. And this isn't like a governmental body. I think when I hear federations, I think of like, I don't know, space fleets or something, just because I'm a nerd. But Jewish federations are usually sort of Jewish organizations within different cities. They're usually major metropolitan areas. That act as sort of funds of funds, if you will. So it's often like a central clearinghouse for donations, where if you give money to the federation then distributes that money to other Jewish charities in the area or nationally or worldwide, so that by, let's say, making a single donation, let's say you write a check for however much, $18 to the Jewish Federation, the Federation then can contribute that to like $1 each to 18 different charities or whatever their portfolio of tzedakah is. And that's how the Federation has been able to make major gifts to help, small organizations become more strong organizations. It's given a lot of money to support the state of Israel, to various causes in the city. So if you're ever at a loss, let's say you have lots of good charities in mind, but you can't decide among them and you want to make your donation really go far, a good thing to do is to give to the Federation, and then they see that money along, pooled with others, distributed to lots of different things. And so, look, if there's a favorite charity that you have, if you're passionate about, food justice, take a look at Mazon, or other Jewish charities for that. There's lots of cities have an organization called Sova, which distributes food to people who need food. So if you have a favorite charity, by all means, contribute to that charity. But if not being able to decide among charities is keeping you from giving, that sort of paralysis of analysis, if you will, then an easy thing to do is give money to the Federation, because they see that it goes to a good place. All right, I think just going to check for more questions. People are sharing some interesting last-minute matzah recipes. We've been having a lot of matzah pizza around this house. The other night I grilled asparagus and also grilled some mushrooms, and those have made some excellent matzah pizza toppings. And so that might be a question, question of the day for the Jew Curious School. I'm going to go pop into that right after I'm done here and say, okay, what's your favorite chametz that you're looking forward to when Passover is done? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. This has been our Parashat Hashavua discussion of Parashat Re'eh by way of studying the reading that's going to be done in synagogues this coming Shabbat, which is the 8th day of Passover. I'm going to be, after it's sundown tonight, if you don't hear from me, we've got, beginning at sundown tonight and going through sundown Saturday is 2 festival or Chag days of Passover. So I'm going to be offline for a couple of days, but excited to get back to you after Shabbat. And once it is no longer Passover and we're deep into the beer and the bread and the pizza and the whatnots, be happy to learn with you more then. Just want to say real quick that this broadcast would not be possible without the students of the Jew Curious School. So just to make a quick plug, if you're looking to take your Jewish learning to the next level, but maybe you don't have a synagogue in your town, or maybe you don't have a rabbi that you connect with, or maybe you haven't met other Jew Curious people like you, then I highly suggest you check out the Jew Curious School, just because what we have put together, there's about 45 students in there right now, and what we put together is a community of learning for Jew Curious people from literally all over the world. And so if you're the kind of person that wants to learn more but don't have access to those resources where you are, check out the Jew Curious School. And you can go there by checking out jewcurious.school/info. There's also a link that'll pop up here on the video here in a minute. And just see if it's right for you. There are 3 live classes a week. My favorite part, however, is the community forums where people get in and talk to each other, get to know each other, share their struggles, share support with one another, share the occasional joke and book recommendation and recipe as well. And if you're ever concerned that you can't be there for the live lessons, all of those are recorded. And I just checked, as of this week, we have over 60 hours of video lessons in there on various Jewish topics as a part of our weekly Torah study, as a part of our monthly deep dive into different subjects, and as a part of our ongoing introduction to Judaism class. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, go to jewcurious.school/info and check it out. See if it's right for you. And that school has not only made an incredible, kind, generous, learning community of Jew Curious people just like you possible, but it also sustains these broadcasts that we do throughout the week. So until next time, heroes, I want to wish you a Chag Sameach, enjoy the rest of your Passover, a Zis and Pesach, and a Shabbat Shalom. And until we learn together again, peace.